Hi everybody and welcome to the Digital Life. In this video I will show you how to easily create your own private VPN server with WireGuard running in a Docker container. And this was highly requested from you guys because I recently also did a video about how to install and configure WireGuard on an Ubuntu server. So if you haven't already checked out this video, please do so. In that video we had to create our own private and public keys and also created our static configuration files for the server and all clients. But when using the Docker image I'm using in this tutorial, this will be automatically created for you. The Docker container will create all private and public keys and also create static configuration files for the server and all your clients. It will also run a DNS server, so I think that is a pretty easy and much more faster deployment method. So if you want to learn how to do that, keep watching. But before we start with this tutorial, let me explain a few things you need to consider when running a VPN tunnel. Because I think currently there's a lot of confusion on the internet about what a VPN does and what a VPN does not. And if you're one of these guys hoping to increase your privacy, surf more securely on the internet or hide your identity, you probably will need to lower down a bit your expectations. Because all we do is create a secured tunnel from your client to your WireGuard server. So that means whenever your client will send out any network packets, that get routed through that secure tunnel, and all these network packets are encrypted and no one in between can really inspect or track those packets. But you need to be aware of your internet outbreak point will be at your WireGuard server, so whatever is sent out from there may still be unencrypted or may be still tracked by anyone. So it really comes down to where is your WireGuard server located and how secured that is. Although many VPN providers may tell you something different, a VPN tunnel is not a tool to increase your privacy and it's not a tool to serve more secure on the internet. But I still think a VPN tunnel can make sense in a lot of cases. For instance, if you want to access the internet through big public or shared networks like in hotels or public Wi-Fi networks. Or if you want to easily gain access from anywhere to your local area network at home when your WireGuard server is running there. Or if you want to avoid country blocking when your WireGuard server is running in a cloud environment in a different country. So in these cases I also think it makes a lot more sense to run your own private VPN server than just use a VPN server provider. Because otherwise you would give a lot of control away and you put a lot of trust into that service provider and you really never know how they are handling your data or how they are securing your data. So I think it makes more sense to create your own private VPN server, and using WireGuard in combination with a Docker container is a very easy approach to do that. So let me share my screen with you guys and we will start right now. To do a short demonstration, I have just created a new virtual machine and installed Ubuntu 20.04 LTS in the server version. You can also follow this tutorial with any other Ubuntu or Debian based Linux distro. It may also work on other ones as well, but that is not really tested or optimized by the creator of the Docker image. Okay, so if you have not installed Docker and Docker Compose already, let's do that. You can also skip this part if you already have Docker and Docker Compose installed. And don't worry, you don't need to remember all these commands or type them from this video. You can also have a look at the description of this video. I've put you a link to my written blog article. There I have written all steps we are doing in this tutorial, and you can just copy and paste the commands I'm using in this guide. So first let us install some prerequisites to be able to install the Docker and Docker Compose. And we also need to add the docker.com repository in our packet sources. So after doing that, we also need to do an update to update our packet sources, and then we can install the Docker CE, Docker CE CLI and the containerized engine. So I will skip that part because that will take some time. If that is finished and Docker is installed successfully, we can now install Docker Compose. So we simply just download a file and place that in our user local binary directory. Don't forget to make this file executable with this command here. And we can also add our current user to the Docker group, so we don't need to place a sudo command in front of any Docker or Docker compose commands. If you've done that, you need to re-log into your shell, or you can just simply type in new group Docker, and that will reload all the memberships of that group. To check that, let me just clear my screen, guys, and you should be able to execute this command docker run hello-world. So that should pull the Docker image from the Docker hub and run this hello world image. If you see a screen like this, hello from Docker, everything is working fine. You can also check if you have installed docker-compose correctly with this command here, docker compose version, and you should see the docker compose version. We can now create our docker compose configuration file that will manage our Docker container with WireGuard. So to do that, I will create a new folder in the opt directory, and I will call this WireGuard-server. I will also change the permission to my current Linux user I'm using. So that will make sure we have the correct permissions when we create the Docker compose file, and if the Docker container will also create those configuration files and the private and public keys, you actually have the right permissions on your current user. So that is also very important. Let's step into this directory. So let's go to the WireGuard server directory, and we will now start creating our Docker compose file. So let's just create a new file that is called docker-compose.yaml. And when we create this empty file, we will now use a Docker image or a template of this that will use a Docker image from the site linuxserver.io. So if you haven't already checked out these guys, let me show you the homepage. So the guys from linuxserver.io, they maintain community images, and they are some enthusiasts from across the world who build and maintain these collection of Docker images for the community. So you can also check their images in the images section, and if you scroll down, you can see what these guys are doing. So I think they are doing an incredible work, so that is really nice. If you haven't checked out them, please do so. I will also put you a link to their homepage in the description below. If you scroll down, you can also see a Docker image that is called Linux server/WireGuard. And if you click on that and go to the homepage on the Docker hub, you will get directed to the official documentation of that image. So that is really nice. You can see it's frequently updated, and there's everything described that is used in that Docker image. You can also see how to use that with just a Docker command, but I think it's much more easier to use the Docker compose template. So you can just copy this here and put this in your Docker compose file in your directory and use this as a template. You need to customize a few things. So let me just copy that and place that in this file, and we can go over this step by step. So we are using a Docker compose configuration file from the scheme 2.1. So we are creating a new service that is called WireGuard from the image Linux server/WireGuard. So these guys already have provisioned that image to the Docker hub, so you don't need to clone any repository or build your images yourself. So that is very easy. We also set the Docker container name to WireGuard, so we can easily access this container in the Docker command. And we will also need to add 2 permissions. If you want to know what these permissions are really doing, you can also refer to the documentation on the docker.com homepage. So let's check this. So you can see the net admin performs various network related operations. So that is needed in order to manage the network. And we also add this option here, so that is the sys module, load and unload kernel modules. So that is very important because, as I said before, the WireGuard kernel module needs to be loaded on the host operating system. And because the Docker container is an isolated one, we need to add this permission manually, so the Docker container will have the correct permission to load the WireGuard kernel module at your host operating system's kernel. Next, we have some environment variables that will set the configuration for our WireGuard server. So this here, the PUID and the PGID, that is set to 1000. And that can be different in your environment, so we should have a look at the Linux server documentation. So if you scroll down, you can see a part like this here, user and group identifiers. And when using volumes, permission issues can arise between the host operating system and the container. And to avoid that, we will set the user identifier and the group identifier to the ID of your current Linux user. So if you have created your folder, let me just exit this here. If you have created your folder, remember I have set the owner of this folder to my user Christian. So my user Christian has the identifier 1000. And that is okay, so I will use the 1000. If you have another user that has a different identifier, you should add this identifier and change this in the Docker Compose configuration file. So in my case, 1000 is fine. It's also default if you just have created one user and you're using that. Next, we need to set our time zone. So I can set this to Europe, London. I could also change that to Europe, Berlin, probably. And then we will need to specify the server URL. So these parameters are only needed when running the WireGuard in server mode. So that is what we want to do here. And you can also specify that here. So enter an IP address or DNS name, or you can set it to auto. When you do it with the auto setup, the Docker image will automatically try to determine your public IP address. So it will make a lookup to any web server and then check what is your external public IP address. Because I'm using that in my own local area network as a virtual machine test setup, I cannot use that because the client I will connect needs to refer to the private IP address and not to the public one. So you need to really think of where is your server located and where are your clients located. Usually you should set this to auto when your clients are located in a different network and you want to access your WireGuard server with your public IP address at this point. But in my case, I'm using a private IP address, so I'm typing in this here. This is the private IP address of my Ubuntu server. You could also change the server port, so the 51820 is the default port for WireGuard, but you can also customize it to anything else. And the next parameter peers will tell the Docker image or the Docker container how many client configurations we want to create. So you can also set this to any other number, and the Docker container, when it first starts, will automatically create configuration files and private and public keys and a QR code for all these clients. So in this case, I'm just creating one peer. I will show you how to add a different or a second or third peer afterwards. And if you want to use a DNS server, you can also specify that here. So if you set this to auto, the client configuration file will point at the DNS server running on your WireGuard server. So when you run this Docker image, it has also a pre-configured and pre-installed DNS server running on it. And with setting this to auto, the clients will use your DNS server that is running on your WireGuard Docker container. But you can also set this to any other IP address if you want to use a different DNS server. And you can also specify the internal subnet. I leave it like this because I don't have any different subnet with the same subnet mask, so that should be fine. And then we need to set our configuration paths. So when the WireGuard server is running at the first time, it will create the server configuration, the client configuration, the DNS server configuration in this folder. And you can also change these configuration files later or copy them and distribute that to your clients. So in this case, I will use the same folder I've just created, opt/WireGuard server. You need to make sure the Docker container has the correct permissions to access this folder. So that should be fine. We also need to have a volume placed to the library module section. That is needed when you need to compile or run the kernel headers when your kernel is older than the 5.6 version. So it doesn't have the WireGuard kernel modules already included in your host operating system's kernel. Then you will need to do that, but I will leave it like this. And you also need to expose this port here. So that is the port. If you have customized that, you need to change it here, of course, as well. And this one here, the sysctls, I just leave it like this. I think that is needed for the container and also for client configuration to work it properly. And you can also reset or set this here, the restart. You can also set this to always if you have any issues and stop your container and you just do a reboot to enable it again. You can also set this to always if you want to do that. Let's save this. and exit this. We can now start our Docker container with a simple command docker-compose up. Don't forget to place a -d in order to make this Docker container run in the background, and just hit enter. So if you haven't already pulled the WireGuard server image from Linux Server IO, this is automatically downloading it from Docker Hub, and once this is finished, it should start the WireGuard server. You can see the Docker container is now successfully started. You can also check this with docker compose ps, and you see it has one container that is up. So if you now want to check your WireGuard server with the wg command, you will see this is not installed because we are running that on the host operating system. If you want to use that command in order to check whenever there is a client connected or what is the status of your server, you need to execute this wg command in your Docker container. To do that, simply just type in docker exec -it, then you will need to use the name WireGuard, that is the name of our Docker container, and then the command wg. If we execute this, you can see it is now working. We have here the public key, the private key of course is hidden, and there's one peer that is automatically created because we have set the parameter peers to 1. And if we do an ls here in this folder, you can also see there is a new folder created by the Docker container. And if we cd into that config folder, do an ls, you can see there's a wg0.conf, so that is a configuration file of our WireGuard server. And we also have the config files for the core DNS, that is a DNS server running in that container. The peer 1, this contains all configuration files, private and public keys of our client. And also the server. We also have some templates for the configuration files, but we really don't need them. Let's just have a look at the wg0.conf file, and you can see this is our server's configuration file. So this just looks like a usual WireGuard configuration file. You can see the private key, the public key, everything in here. If you check the correct permissions, you can also see this configuration file also has read and write permissions to your user. So this is also securely stored on your computer, and no one else than this user or the owner of this folder we have used can access these files. So you should also check that, because when you go to the servers folder and do an ls here, you can see there's a private and the public key. So you need to store that in a secure way. So the creators of Linux Server IO have also taken care of that, so that is very nice. And we simply could just now connect any client. If you want to connect with a client to your WireGuard server, you simply just go to the peer 1 folder. Oh, we need to go to the config folder first, sorry. And if we do an ls, you can see here is a peer1.png, so that contains a QR code. I will show you later what this is. And also the peer1.config file. So we need to just use this config file and distribute that config file to any client and use that as our WireGuard configuration file. It also has the private and public keys. It also has all the configuration we have set. So if we have a look at this file, you can see it already has configured the endpoint to the public IP address we have just used, and it has set the DNS server, it has set the private IP address and the client public and private key. It also has set the allowed IP address to all, so that means all traffic is automatically routed through the tunnel. If you would need to change that, so you only want to route specific traffic through the tunnel from your client, you would need to change this line here and change this to the networks you want to route through the tunnel. Okay guys, so let me just show a simple example how to easily connect a client, because you can also connect many other operating systems or different clients. If you check the installation instruction on the wireguard.com homepage, you can see there's a client available for Windows, for macOS, for Linux, Android, iOS and other Linux distributions as well. So you just can refer to this here, install the client on your computer or whenever you want to install that, and just use the peer1.conf configuration file and distribute that to the client, and everything should be set up correctly. I have already created a Ubuntu client, so that is in version 18.04. And let's just install WireGuard. So to do that, just enter sudo apt install WireGuard. And we also need the resolve-conf package that is needed for the DNS command used in the wg quick command. So what we need to do is we now need to copy the peer1.conf file of the server to the client. I just do that with scp, so I just copy the peer1.conf to the client, and I just store this in my personal folder, peer1.conf. Yes, and just enter the password. So it should be located on our client as well. So if we do an ls here, here's our peer1.conf file. And what we're gonna do now is we just copy this. So I can also move this file because we don't need it in my personal folder again, and move this to the etc WireGuard wg0.conf file. We can now start the WireGuard client with the command wg quick up wg0. Now the WireGuard client should be connected to the server. To check that, just enter wg with sudo permissions, of course, and you can see the handshake is 14 seconds ago. So the client is now connected to our WireGuard server. We can also check this on the WireGuard server, of course. We now need to execute the wg command in the Docker container, of course. So just enter docker exec it WireGuard wg. And you can see we can also see here the peer is connected from endpoint ID, so that is the IP address of my client with that private IP address. So if we want to add more than one client, for instance, I just want to add my mobile phone also as a client to the WireGuard server, I need to increase the number of peers. If you want to do that, you simply just go to the Docker Compose file, edit this, and just increase the peer number by 1 or by the number of peers you just want to create. And just write this to the file. We now need to restart our Docker container simply with the up-d and enter a force recreate. If we hit enter, we are now recreating the WireGuard container, and it should add automatically a second peer configuration file. So if we cd into that config folder and do an ls, you can see there is a peer2 folder created. And if you, for instance, want to add a mobile client, you can just go to the App Store and download the WireGuard client, and then execute this command here. Docker exec it WireGuard, so we're executing a command in the WireGuard container, app show peer, show-peer, and then the number of the peer you want to show the QR code. So I want to show the QR code for peer 2. Just hit enter and you can see it now prints us a QR code. So I can now grab my phone, open the WireGuard client and scan this QR code, and I have automatically created the tunnel interface and also added all the configuration file. I can then just enable that and my mobile phone will automatically connect to the WireGuard server. So I think that is pretty easy. I think that is just great what the guys from Linux Server IO have created. It is very easy, but you would need to have some knowledge of Docker and also Docker Compose. So if you want to learn more about Docker and Docker Compose and why this is just amazing, you can also have a look at my other 2 videos about Docker and also Docker Compose. I've put you a link in the description below. Check them out. I hope you liked this video and you could also learn something new. And if you want to learn more about Linux, Python, Docker, cloud, networking and all this stuff, and you really want to become an IT professional, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. You can also leave me a comment or join my Discord server if you want to discuss that, or if you want to get in touch with people who share the same interests like you. So thanks everybody for watching, enjoy the rest of your day, take care of yourself, and I see you soon.